Go for it.
Yep.
All right, let's do it. Thanks everyone for jumping on. As I said a minute ago, if you weren't here yet, I'm going to go off video so I save you from having my frozen face on your screen for the rest of this. But you really want to see the PowerPoint because that's where all the good stuff is anyway. So welcome here to obviously not talk about strategic planning. Many of you have been through a strategic planning process before, so not all of you, and that's perfectly okay. The point and objective today for this session is to, let me see the slide click here, do a couple things. First and foremost, I want to get to some level of clarification around what strategy actually is. There's often misconceptions around what strategy is, so we're just going to first and foremost level set around that. We're going to talk about terminology because that's another place of confusion. What are the words that we're using? What do those words mean? How do they all fit together and work together? And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about process. How do we actually make the strategic plan? And what's the process to actually review that plan on a regular basis? Why do we do that? And how do we actually do it? So those are the three sort of objectives for today. I hope this is what you signed up for. Because we're going to spend the next 60 minutes or so going through it. So maybe just administratively, I'll just mention for whatever reason, I'm having trouble seeing the chat or really anything that Zoom has. So Aaron, if you want to just like interrupt or ping me if there's a spot where I should stop, or just please do that, okay?
Sounds good.
All right, diving right in, let's do this. So first and foremost, what is strategy? Thinking about answering this question, I thought about, what are the traditional strategic planning methodologies? And there's a lot of them. And I think this is what maybe contributes to a lot of the confusion and complexity of strategy. Partly because there's a lot out there and it often mixes definitions and words with process, and these things get lumped together. But I can tell you, when my own personal learning and thinking about strategy went through a process something like this, and this is not far off from what a lot of strategic planning processes look like, where you get in a room and you do a whole bunch of analysis and internal, external analysis, usually by way of a SWOT analysis, if you've gone through that type of activity before. You think about your mission, your values, you paint a picture for what it is you want to achieve, and then from there, sort of sort through the objectives and the tactics and the plan itself, and then you monitor and execute on it. So that's one way to do it. You may have also come across things like the Kaplan and Norton balanced scorecard, a little bit more complex, but very popular amongst organizations that, again, think about vision and strategy, and then they break down vision and strategy into 4 specific perspectives around financial and process and growth and customer. That's another one that allows you to think about strategic planning and get to a strategic plan. And probably maybe the most popular one, if you've gone through a business or MBA program, you've certainly come across Porter's 5 Forces, which talks about intensity of rivalry and shaping your strategic plan around threat of new entrants and bargaining power and threat of substitutes. Quite honestly, though, all of these things, although good and interesting and helpful, are extremely confusing. Scott was very disappointed when I put this question mark up because he thought we were going to talk about all these things. We are not going to talk about all of these things right now. They are helpful, they are useful, but quite honestly, these complex methodologies, frameworks, processes, they contribute to this idea that strategy is this complex, far away, nebulous thing that happens in a closed door room with MBAs in a boardroom, and they figure it all out and they come back down and distribute it through the organization and cascade it downwards for people to absorb and live by. And I would say that that's quite the opposite of what we're trying to achieve when we think about strategy and strategic planning. Bottom line is, with all these things, people make strategy harder than it actually needs to be. So I'm here to tell you, first and foremost, inside the first 5 minutes of this presentation, that strategy at the simplest level is choosing how you will achieve a stated outcome. And it's, you know, I'm trying to demystify this, but, you know, also may disappoint you a little bit that it is actually, can actually be that simple. At its simplest level, strategy is about choosing how you achieve a stated outcome. Which means the good news around this is that strategy is actually available to all of us. In fact, you as a team lead not only have an opportunity, you have an obligation in your role to think about strategy and make specific choices for your team, with your team, because strategy actually occurs at the team lead level through the one-page strategic plan process. And if you can get your head wrapped around that, when you are working with your team, working to create and iterate on a one-page strategic plan, you are in fact creating and executing on strategy if you're making those specific choices. If I take that one step further and lean on a guy named Peter Drucker, Peter says, setting priorities is easy, setting posteriorities is hard and usually unpleasant. And what Peter is actually saying is that, you know, strategy is certainly about setting priorities, but it's actually often more so about choosing what you will stop doing. What is it that you will not do is a fundamental element of strategy. And I know all of you have experienced this at one point in your life, either in your current role or another role. You go through a process, you create a long list of ideas to pursue, all of which are great ideas, and you want to do them all. And then somehow, some way through the strategic planning process, you package it all up into a thing that is seemingly a choice, but it's actually avoided the fact that you have chosen, that you avoided choosing what not to do. So through this process, and that we're going to talk about today, if I can get two things across to you, that would be a win for me. A, that strategy is about choice, and really good strategy is about choosing what not to do. And if you get those two concepts and start applying those, that you are well on your way to creating and executing on strategy. All right, we're 10 minutes in, and that was like, you know, if you take that away alone, that would be good. But from here, we're going to break strategy down a little bit further into some terminology and actually work through a process to actually get the strategic plan in place. So terminology. What are the words we use when we're talking about strategic planning? So one way to think about a strategic plan is like a compass and a map. And your compass is really like your purpose and your values, that why you exist element for for your team. It's a constant in your life, and it sort of guides your decision making. It guides the types of things that you do, guides the decisions that you make. So think of strategy and the why behind strategy as your compass. And from there, you can then start to think about where is it that you want to go? And that in our language is referred to as a mission. A mission is that concept of something that's far off in the distance. You know you're trying to get to it. It may seem a little bit fuzzy or far out there, but it is ultimately that spot that you're striving to get to. Sorry, go ahead. Did I miss? We're good? Okay, sorry, I thought I heard someone ask a question in there. So mission, that place that you're trying to get to. Other companies will use other words for this. You'll often see vision, you'll see aspiration, you'll see future state. They all in effect mean much the same thing. We use the word mission to express that determination of what we're trying to get to. Another concept, another key word to think about is then your milestones. And milestones are basically major accomplishments along the way towards that mission. Kind of markers, if you will. They're usually can be quite significant, but they tell you that you're on your way towards getting towards that mission. And then within there, you also have goals. Goals are more of those short-term achievable and measurable results. Again, indicate progress towards a certain milestone or a mission. And then finally, the last concept is your how, your choices, which show up in the form of areas of focus and initiatives that represents the choice that you've made for how you're going to achieve that mission. the specific things that you're going to do and not do to, to get towards that mission and achieve the goals and the milestones along the way. So that's one way to think about it. Those are all the basically fundamental terminology. And honestly, if you look at any sort of strategic planning methodology, they will in some way, shape, or form refer to these types of concepts and definitions. Words might be different, but the concepts are the same. If I translate that in a slightly different way, if you're like me and like things, you know, less analogous and more linear, it might look something like this. Again, that mission is that overarching aim that you're striving towards. Your goals and your milestones wrap around that mission. And then you can begin to ask questions like, well, how will I achieve that mission? And those show up in the form of first areas of focus being major strategic objectives that must be achieved. Usually there's 2 or 3, not many. They're sort of significant things that you're working towards that represent how you're going to get there. And then those further break down, again, asking yourself, how will we achieve those areas of focus? Will break down into specific strategic initiatives. And these are, again, choices around activities you'll take to execute on an area of focus. So all these things collectively make up the what and the how of your strategic plan. And you can see that actual 1-page strategic plan document. It comes together like this. First and foremost, why we exist and what are the values. These are sort of foundational to the team, the organization that represents who we are, why we exist, and the value and how we behave, represented by our values. That's foundational for setting a stage for what is it that we're trying to achieve. Mission, milestone, goals. Metrics we're going to talk about later, but metrics are sort of like your gauge, your dashboard to show that, you know, to know that you're on the right path. And then, of course, how. How is it that we're going to achieve the mission, milestone, and the goals, represented by areas of focus, initiatives. Of course, there's other components around who does what, but those are fundamentally, those are the building blocks of the strategic plan. And just, I hope maybe this is all redundant to you. I hope it is, but it is really important to just to understand and level set that these are the components of strategic planning. And this is how it all hangs together. Make sense so far?
Hey, Jeff, can I ask a question?
Okay.
Why is the what section at the end as opposed to in the middle?
Yeah, we get that. That's a common question. And I know where you're going with this. It does seem to be more logical, perhaps, if you think of it in a linear way, why, what, and how. CK or Tracy might be able to help me out on this, but my understanding of it is
Sure, CK here, really briefly.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, you know, we played around with this design a little bit, and we've actually certainly going to bring continuous improvements to it. But we were inspired by the Start With Why, the golden circle. So if you watch the Simon Sinek video, he talks about this aspect of direction of why at your core, and how he shares the story of how the what is really the last aspect of flow, but there is some aspects that we feel that we can improve. But if you watch the Simon Sinek video, it'll give you some sense as to the rationale behind it. But yeah, there's we have some improvements that kind of solve what he was looking for in that mindset, but also makes it more logical. But watch the video and you'll see why.
It is it's a great video. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. But you know, to CK's point, I know people, and myself included, it for whatever reason, it seems more natural to think about, okay, why is fundamental. I've got those as my foundation. Now I can start to think about what is it, that aim that I want to achieve, and how do I do it. I think both work, quite frankly, but you know, ultimately the definitions are the same. So as long as you understand what those definitions are and the concepts, I think it should all work out.
Fair enough. Thanks.
Yeah, good question.
I've got a question.
Sure.
Where do ongoing goals fit in? Like prevent outages from happening, keep maintenance costs down. Where do those fit?
So ongoing goals that more related to your sort of operations or day-to-day, Vic? I think that's Vic.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, related to your day-to-day,
Yeah.
the costs you want to avoid paying.
Yeah. I would say, and others can maybe weigh in on this, but I would say that, like, you know, just because it's not necessarily on a strategic plan doesn't mean it's not important. There are lots of vehicles and mechanisms to use, even in your tacticals, right? There's lots of space to be able to highlight specific goals that you might want to track or metrics that you want to track. The purpose of this plan, though, and the way we want to think about the one-page strategic plan is, how are those goals related to the specific ends that we are trying to achieve? So that's where we want to focus the effort. Doesn't mean that other stuff's not important, and there are other places I believe that we can highlight those things, but for the purpose of the plan, we really want to think about goals in the context of, how do we know we're on our way to achieving that mission or milestone? It's a long-winded way of saying you can still have the other goals, Vic.
Thank you.
I'm trying to watch the other, oh, we got the Simon Sinek in the chat. That's awesome. Good to move on. Any other questions? Okay, let's keep moving. So this again sort of hopefully level sets the foundational elements of what goes into a strategic plan, the basic building blocks, if you will. From here, I now want to talk about, well, how do we populate the strategic plan? What is the content that goes into a strategic plan? And this is where the lines maybe start to blur in terms of, like, the common foundational elements and the process that you go through to get some of the answers that would populate your strategic plan. So I am now going to use a framework, even though I just, you know, made fun of all the other frameworks, but this is where they are actually helpful, is to think about, how do we answer questions that get us to a spot to fill in the blanks, if you will, for what goes into the strategic plan. So this is an example of methodology, and there are many out there, but this is one that I've been using recently, and I quite like it because of its simplicity, called the strategy cascade. And you'll note that, you know, it's asking a whole bunch of questions around aspirations, where to play, how to win, capabilities, and management systems. And the whole idea is to ask yourself these questions in order to get your strategic plan. But really, you know, it ties directly to the concepts we just talked about. A winning aspiration is just another way to describe a what, if you will. We use the word mission. Roger Martin, who's the author of this, talks about a winning aspiration. In essence, it's still an idea of what you're striving to get to. And then the other building blocks, where to play, how to win, capabilities, and systems, are actually really about how. They're asking you to answer questions around how. What are the choices you'll make to achieve that winning aspirations? So different language, same concepts. So we're going to use this tool and this methodology to help you think about, how do I get the content into my plan that would answer those questions, the what we want to achieve and how we want to achieve it. So first, let me talk a little bit about a winning aspiration. As I said, this is not much unlike a mission. Ask what it is you aspire to achieve. It forces you to answer, what does it mean to win? What does the accomplishment look like in the end? Honestly, every strategy book, process, methodology, framework, in some way, shape, or form, will start with a question like this, which is beginning with the end in mind. What is it that we're striving to achieve? From there, a where to play question using the strategy cascade is asking you, out of all the potential markets available to us, which segments of the market do we seek to win with? Which are the customers that we will target? In fact, which are the customers that we will not target? What are the markets that we do not want to be in? In other words, all this is asking is, who is your customer? From there, once you've defined that much, you can then ask yourself, how is it that we'll win? For the markets that we've chosen, what specifically is our competitive advantage? It will be some sort of low cost advantage, or it will be some sort of differentiated advantage. What is it that you'll offer that's unique amongst competitors In other words, you know, you might hear language like, what is your value proposition? These two things together, where to play and how to win, are basically the you know, the essence of your strategic plan. If you answer those two things alone, you will be well on your way to having a very good strategic plan. The best strategies are those where it's clear and there's a tight match between where it is you want to play and how it is you'll win. The other elements are important, but those two together are really quite critical. Next one I'll talk about is capabilities. So capabilities are, again, those activities that produce your competitive advantage, the strengths that you might have to leverage, the things that you're really good at and give you some indication of how you'll win. They could actually be the things that you don't have, actually, and that you need to acquire in order to execute on that how to win. But ultimately, it's internally focused, thinking about what is it that we have to work with, makes up our capabilities to execute on a how to win strategy. And finally, management systems, similar to an internal type focus. This question is asking about what are the systems, the processes, the norms, in some case culture, even if you want to extend it that for, in order to effectively execute on this strategy. You know, we have all of these elements in our organization already, and they're working and they're evolving and they're iterating, and that's all great. But I would encourage you, I honestly think this gets more overlooked than it should. And especially as team leads, it's really easy for you to think about how effectively are we working together? That's maybe a question you could ask that would sort of fall into the category of management systems. How is it that we're working together? How could we be operating differently in a way that will make us more effective and more able to sort of execute on the plan that we've set for ourselves? So again, we've talked about sort of the big building blocks of the strategic plan. This is a methodology for thinking about the content that goes into your strategic plan. If you've gone through the process to answer these types of questions, you will be well on your way of fitting them all into your one-page strategic plan. And we're going to go through a bit of an exercise that's going to try and do that in the next 30, 40 minutes or so. Let's use some actual examples because that might help pull this all together. So I picked out a company called Lightspeed, who I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are very familiar with. Lightspeed's a Montreal-based company. They provide cloud-based point-of-sale solutions for small business and restaurant hospitality sector around the world. They've been doing phenomenally well, not just because of their strategy that I'm going to talk about, but for a lot of reasons. But strategy is certainly at least an indicator, I think, of why they've been successful. So this is pulled directly from their last investor presentation. And although they don't call out specifically, here's our mission, here's our strategies, here's our areas of focus, you can kind of back into it by picking out what they do talk about. So first and foremost, they talk about future-proofing the business with technology for the new commerce economy. That is arguably a winning aspiration, maybe a mission if they choose to use that word. It's something that's sort of out there. It's long-term. They're determined to get to it. It may even be a little bit vague or fuzzy, if you will, but it's ultimately an aim that they're focused on achieving. I don't personally know what the new commerce economy might be. Maybe they don't either, but they've set it out there as something that they're striving to get to. And is guiding their decisions, that winning aspiration or what it is they want to achieve. Furthermore, they have broken down in pretty good detail where it is they'll play. They talk about Lightspeed as having omni-channel solutions that are powering SMBs around the world, SMBs being small, medium-sized businesses. And just knowing a little bit about Lightspeed, I know that they're focused on winning with small retail business, and restaurants around the world. So they actually have, articulated to some degree where it is they'll play, which is part of a how question. How will they get to this aspiration? They will do it by way of focusing on small, medium-sized businesses around the world. From there, you can go further and start to understand their how to win choices. So they talk about their growth strategies, which are effectively choices for how they will be successful with SMBs around the world. And they talk about things like expanding their customer base to take advantage of these small businesses that are transitioning from legacy technology to cloud-based point of sale solutions. They talk about, you know, expanding their product set, specifically in e-commerce and payments, as a way to offer more to this customer base. And they talk about increasing revenue by way of selling add-on solutions around their core offering, like accounting and analytics. Should sound similar to other strategies that you're familiar with, but in essence, they've broken down in pretty good detail, you know, what it is they're trying to achieve, the target market they're wrapping their strategy around, and specific choices they're making for how they'll win. I have no doubt that inside the organization, this would break down even further into more specific initiatives. But in essence, you can start to see how the what and the how come together for Lightspeed. I'll give you one other example, and then I'll pause maybe for if we have time for a little bit of Q&A here. But this is pulled from another company. This is from Neiman Marcus, a luxury department store retailer. And this is a little bit dated. This is from 2017. But it's interesting if you know something about Neiman Marcus, where they are today, and looking back at their strategy that they established 3 years ago. There's a couple things I don't actually like about this strategy. First of all, they use words like accelerate digital first and encourage innovation, which I think is basically a nod towards sort of moving online in a digital experience. They use words like encourage innovation, which is, in my mind, a weasel word. A weasel word is that idea of, you know, something that sounds really good, like efficiency or encourage innovation or reliability. It sounds great, but it actually means almost nothing. There's no real meaningful content behind it. But man, does it look good? And it is really nice to put these kind of things on your strategic plan. So watch out for that. The other thing that these guys did is they talk about serving the customers of today and tomorrow, which in my mind, maybe they know what that is. Maybe this breaks down somewhere, but to an outsider looking in, I really don't know which markets they're specifically targeting. How is it that you can serve the customers today and tomorrow? Are they the same customers? Are they different customers? Are the customers transitioning to something else? Are their needs the same, or are they different? They haven't gotten really specific about where it is they're choosing to play. And then finally, they talk about continuing to elevate the experience while transforming the business to better meet evolving customer expectations. This is maybe the most serious flaw in the strategy, which in my mind is not a choice at all. They've said explicitly, we're going to continue to do what we're doing, and simultaneously, we're going to transform the business. That is an awfully hard thing to pull off, but it's made even harder. Imagine sort of digesting this and thinking about how you're going to help make this true when you've effectively said, we're going to do two things, and we're not going to give clarity to which one is more important or which one we're going to do altogether. And in fact, if you follow the Neiman Marcus story, they had a lot of challenges in front of them, but I would argue that failure to choose, in this case, what was digital commerce over traditional in-store department store shopping for luxury retail goods, you know, in part at least, caused them to declare bankruptcy not long ago. I'm sure accelerated by COVID, but just basically not paying attention to and executing on a strategy that was digital first when their customers were actually shifting that direction. So to recap where we're at the moment, we've talked about strategy is about making a specific choice, including what you will not do. We've talked about the basic building blocks of the one-page strategic plan, which is built around the why, the purpose and the values, the what, the mission, milestone, the goals that represent what it is you're trying to achieve, and the how, the choices that come in the form of areas of focus and initiatives that are the decisions for how you're going to execute on that plan. And finally, we've started to talk a little bit about the content. What is it that makes up the content of the strategic plan that you should articulate? It should specifically address, as much as possible, who your customer is, how you will win. Ideally, if you can start to think about internally, what are the capabilities we have or need, or the systems or the processes that we have or need to improve that complement those how you win type choices. I'll say it right now because someone's going to ask a question about this. Not every plan, not everyone in the organization may have a need to define who their customer is, which is perfectly fine. It doesn't mean you shouldn't know who your customer is. You should, and that should be clear. It may not have to live in your particular plan, depending on what team you're on, what plan you're creating. But you should ultimately know and be thinking about who that customer is, and then answering the other questions, building your plan around how is it that you're going to win with that particular customer. Make sense so far? Man, this is really hard to do on Zoom. Silence is agreement. Makes perfect sense. Clear as mud. Yeah. Makes sense. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Okay. I'm glad it makes sense. It's going to get more, not muddy, but you know, it's going to get more complex from here. You ready? We've got a sense of how this all works and how it fits together. So now we're going to talk about definitions. We've talked about terminology. We've talked about content. The next part of strategy often is process. How do you actually make it? How do you get to the point, you know, where you're working through a process that asks the right questions in a way that you can get to that point of saying what it is we're trying to achieve and how will we achieve it. So I'm going to attempt to take you through a process. There are lots out there, but this is one that I'm going to attempt to walk through with you and attempt to do in real time as well with you. A methodology that helps answer those questions. I'm going to warn you, this is going to be fast, way faster than you like, but hopefully use it as like an example, something that you could do with your team. Honestly, this is something that you could spend a day, if you really wanted, in a workshop format with your team, thinking about going through a process like this. But for now, we'll go through it, try to do it on your own, and use it as a tool that you may choose to use with your team later. All right, here we go. So first and foremost, what I want you to do is think about a strategic problem that you face, either as the whole organization, or maybe better yet, you know, specifically on your team. What is a strategic problem that you're facing right now? And the way to maybe think about this is, you know, think about something that's big enough that it's shared across the team. So it's something that collectively you, with your team, you want to think about solving for, a problem that you face that, you know, you could say to the team, hey, we really need to resolve X, whatever it might be. I'll give you some examples for how to think about this and how these will typically come up at a strategic level. They'll probably fall into a category around customers, in the sense that, you know, maybe your customer base, your customer growth has slowed. Perhaps they're facing a different problem that you saw previously. They're looking for something else. So there could be a number of strategic problems that you're facing around your customers. Could also be, you know, not surprisingly, some questions, some strategic problems you're facing around your competitors. Perhaps your competitors are doing something different than they did before. Perhaps they're competing more effectively on price or some service offering. Maybe they're copying your strategy. There's any number of things that your competitors could be doing in the marketplace that's creating some sort of strategic problem for you. And finally, the other category, if you will, to think about strategic problems is probably somewhere in the vein of company or internal, or maybe even just capabilities to get really specific. This could take the form of, you know, there's a cost position that we're operating in that just doesn't work anymore. Maybe it's more external. There's some external threat that is substituting, you know, the product or the solution that you bring to the market. Or maybe more specifically internal, there's something about, you know, your team. Maybe there's some problem you're facing around the demand that you're not meeting because of capacity or capability that, you know, is just preventing you from achieving the results that you have. Whatever the case might be, some problem that I'm sure you're facing, because everybody is facing some sort of strategic problem that is shared across the team, and think about a problem that you want to wrestle down through the course of the next 30, 40 minutes. I'm going to give you like 5 seconds to think about it, then we're moving on. Okay. Oh, sorry, I was going to say one more thing. If you're doing this with your team or in an exercise, it's very, very typical that you'll think of a problem like that is a symptom of a larger problem. So what do I mean by that? I mean, it would be very easy to say that, oh, man, we have declining revenue month over month. Is that the strategic problem you're facing, or is there a larger strategic problem that needs to be addressed? It's probably a larger strategic problem, and the result of revenue is more sort of an outcome of the strategic problem. So this is a good place to think about why, and continuously ask yourself, why is that problem exist, and try to get to that root cause. Okay, hopefully you got something in your mind you can think about, and I think there's place in that workbook to write this down if you want to follow along and do it together. From there, we're going to take that problem, we're going to completely twist it. We're going to reframe that problem into a strategic question that you want to answer. And specifically, we're going to use the words, how might we? How might we is a way to sort of completely flip the problem and sort of negative orientation around the problem that you're facing into something that's more positive and inquiry-based and opens the door for possibility. So let me break this down. Here's what I mean. So if you're facing a strategic problem around a shrinking total addressable market, as an example, it certainly is a strategic problem. You can flip that and say, how might we shift our target market while maintaining service to our current customer base? It completely changes the orientation of how you're thinking about the strategic problem because it sets up for generating possibilities. Another example might be we're facing intense competition from rivals on price specifically, maybe is the situation you're dealing with. You may turn that and say, how might we further differentiate ourselves to accelerate growth in our target market? Again, we're flipping it to set the stage for generating possibilities by using a how might we question. So as you're listening to me ramble on, think about the strategic problem you created for yourself and try to turn it into a how might we question. Remember that it's a bit of a balancing act. You want it to be open. You want it to be big enough to inspire possibilities, but it should also be focused and narrow enough that you're tackling a specific issue. So it may take a little bit of work. I know it's hard to do on the fly, but that's the idea of how we're going to reframe the problem into a how might we question. All right. Gone that far, let's take the next step. So not surprisingly, perhaps, now that we have a how might we question centered around the strategic problem, now we want to generate possibilities. And this usually works best, or not usually, it always works best in a group setting. And it's a great exercise to do with your team to think about basically what is possible. We have this how might we question. What are all the strategic possibilities that we could consider to help answer that question? It should generate excitement. It should be intriguing. It should actually be uncomfortable if you're really doing it well. It means you're on the right track because you literally want to generate as many possibilities as you can, and then work with your team to sort of group them, theme them, and get to a spot where, when we break it all down, there's a mixture of possibilities that kind of fall into 1, 2, 3 basic buckets that we want to pursue or we want to continue to work through. But that's generally what would happen in a group setting. When you relate this back to the content we talked about before, generating possibilities and going through this exercise will invariably start to answer the questions around. You don't even have to say it. It'll just naturally happen. But you may want to push the team to think about, hey, thinking about possibilities, how does this address our customers and our value proposition? And in all likelihood, you'll generate, a mixture of ideas that get to 1 or 2 or 3 possibilities to expand on. So I'm going to try and give you a bit of an example here. If I take the how might we question I used before around shifting our target market while maintaining our service to our core customer base, possibilities that might come out could be, well, we could expand our products and services to our existing customers. We could add new functionality to our current customer base. Or we could go another direction. We could carve out a team, develop an entirely new product for an entirely new market, but that leverages the history and the strengths we have as an organization. Or there could be another possibility where you think about, let's just take our existing product as it is today and move it into another market entirely. All perfectly valid possibilities, probably some with more merit than others, but valid in the sense that they answer that question of how might we expand and shift our target market. So if you haven't already, take literally seconds, which isn't fair at all, but take a few seconds to think about a couple possibilities that you could use to think about how you might address that how might we question. All right, moving along. Next part of this process is a question around what would have to be true. And this is honestly my favorite part of this whole methodology. It's a great tool, mechanism for forcing you and the team to think about what are the assumptions, what would have to be true in order for this possibility to make sense. It's a way that sort of is inviting, but also grounding. It's a tool that sort of can be very effective at breaking down barriers and assumptions. I'm sure many of you have been in a situation where you got option A, you got option B, and you're arguing with one another about why you should go this way versus that way. Asking yourself a question around what would have to be true actually breaks the standoff, because it forces people to lay out assumptions in a cooperative way rather than being defensive and antagonistic. It actually works with any problem, whether you're dealing with strategy or not. I think you can use this practically in any scenario when you're dealing with any kind of problem as a way to get unstuck and moving everyone away from talking about what they think is right and towards imagining, well, wait a second, what would have to be true in order for this to make sense for us? So let's test this out. So there's a couple categories where you can really start to think about what would have to be true statements. So take a possibility, whatever it is, think about what would have to be true. What would have to be true for customers? What is it that this group believes? What is it that they need? What is it that they're willing to pay for? And in a group setting, it's a great way to just list them all. What are all the truisms around our customers that would make this winning strategy make sense? What would have to be true about our competitors? The competing organizations that we face, the ways that they might react, the competitors that might pop up in the future. What would have to be true about our competitors for this strategic possibility to work? And then finally, around company, what would have to be true about, say, our capabilities? What would be true about our talent? What's the technology that we would need to be able to deliver on this? All of these are ways to just sort of list and categorize all the things that are basically assumptions that you would need to make true in order for the strategic possibility to make sense. So I'll try and give you an example to help tie this all together. So I took the possibility that we, what did I say? That we want to expand. We want to explore the possibility for expanding our product and service to our existing customer base. Basically enter into some new category, but for our current customer base as a way to kind of regenerate growth. Well, it would have to be true that our customers see immediate value in the new category, the new function or feature, whatever it is, to displace what they use today. That would have to be true. It would also have to be true that our competitors are not able to do the same thing very quickly or easily, maybe not at all. So it would have to be true that our competitors can't just copy us. And internally, it would have to be true that our people have the knowledge and expertise to enter into entirely new subject matter, entirely new category. They have the knowledge and expertise to deliver on something such that, you know, the customers believe that it's better than whatever it is they're using before. This is just like a simplistic example, but you know, you could easily see if you're doing this in a group setting how there'd be a ton of what would have to be true statements. But it gets you to a spot to sort of break down better understand, I should say, how it is that that this possibility that we're evaluating would make sense. Okay, next part of this process. I know I'm going through this fast, but hopefully it makes sense. If you have a whole bunch of what would have to be true statements about the possibility that you're exploring, the next step of this process is to think about the barriers. So basically what you would do is you would take your list of what would have to be true statements and say, okay, which ones are really preventing us from choosing one of these strategic options over another? It's basically saying, which ones do we care most about? Which are like all of them are important, but which one are like critically important? Like if this is not true, this is a deal breaker. Those are the ones that are truly your barriers that you really have to address and think about carefully before you're choosing this particular strategy. So a couple ways to think about it is, you know, which are the conditions that we're most worried aren't true? So you've got a list of things of what would have to be true statements. Which ones of those are you most worried about? And then another way to think about it is just simply what do we just not know, right? It's, you know, it's a what would have to be true statement, but we're just not sure if that is true or not true. Those are the things you want to single out and really think about as a team. These are the barriers that we have to overcome. So we'll go back to my example. I said, you know, it would have to be true that our customers immediately see value in that new feature functionality versus whatever way they used to solve that problem before. So it's that to me would be, I could be maybe most uncertain because I just don't know enough about my customers' willingness to accept that new solution over what they use today. Maybe I don't even know what they use today. It's completely unknown. And it's an assumption that I have that they'll choose to do something else. It's critically important because this strategy is going to fall flat if I find out afterwards that actually we don't have that problem or we're perfectly comfortable using what we have today. That assumption needs to be validated in some way. So that's an example of a barrier that I truly want to overcome before I make that call that that's the way we're going to go. So in your example, if you've had a chance to think about what would have to be true statements, I would say circle the 1 or 2 or 3 things that you're most unsure about, because these are the things that you want to, we're gonna work through in the next part of this process. All right. So we've identified some barriers. Next thing we want to do is test to learn about your barriers so you can ultimately shorten your odds of designing a winning strategy. What does that mean? It basically means that we need to gain or lose confidence in the likelihood that what needs to be true actually is true or it's not. You're never going to know for sure. So let's just call that what it is. Strategy is ultimately about, you know, betting or making a decision on what you believe you know about the future. You won't know for certainty, but testing and learning can give you confidence in the decisions that you make. So this part of the process is basically taking those barriers that you think you're up against and that you want to learn more about and testing to find out, how can I get more confident that I can overcome this barrier and then feel more confident in the strategy that I'm picking. There are a ton of ways to do this. You know, you could, sketch out a prototype. You know, you can do internal audits, or I have a slide here. You can do interviews. There's, you know, observations, focus groups, financial analysis. Like, there's really no shortage of ways you can go about learning more about the barrier that you're trying to overcome. I remembered, you know, thinking about Clayton not long ago helped the team go through a design sprint workshop. That's effectively a way to test out an idea to find out, hey, is this possible or not? What do we know? What do we not know in order to sort of embark on this decision and go forward? It really doesn't matter, quite honestly, if it's sort of, really simple or really complex. The whole idea is that you're testing something to find out if you're confident that you can overcome that barrier or not. The other thing I'll say about this is that just like every other part of the strategy process, testing and learning is rarely done alone. This is a great opportunity to involve other stakeholders, maybe people from other teams, other subject matter experts who are key to the success of the strategy. Maybe they haven't been part of your core team, but they can help you better understand by testing and learning. So great opportunity to lean on others, enlist their help to help conduct these types of tests. Say one more thing about this one, and it's a bit of a tangent, but I'm gonna say it anyway. It is really common in strategic plans, and I've certainly been guilty of this as well, to land on something in your actual strategic plan where it says something to the effect of validate that something, or better yet, we'll develop a strategy to find out something. It doesn't really matter what the thing is. The point here is that using language like validate or develop a strategy or determine, those should be clues to you that you don't know enough about the decision that you're trying to make. And it's a very common trap and a pitfall, really, to sort of, it's not that you're trying to purposely avoid a choice, but it's very common to be in a spot where, like, hey, we just don't know. We think this is the right path, but we don't know for certain. Instead of coming up with language on your plan that is, validate that this product will work in the market, pause here for a second, go develop a test and think about how can we determine, give ourselves greater confidence that no, this is the right path or not. I know it's easier said than done, but it's a really effective way to get past the point of uncertainty and to the point of making a specific decision, which is exactly what we're trying to do in our strategic planning. Okay, so having gone through that process and rapid fire succession, if you have asked yourself all of those questions about your possibilities and thought about what would have to be true statements and tested the barriers to find out which is going to work and which is not going to work, you will have effectively answered these questions around what it is you're trying to achieve, where it is you're playing, how it is you'll win, the capabilities and systems you need to get there. And if you've answered these questions by going through this process, then lo and behold, you will have essentially have all the content required to populate the strategic plan, that is what it is you're trying to do and how you're going to do it. There will be more work to do, don't worry. I mean, there's no question there'll be, plans to think about gaps in the plan, specific initiatives, thinking forward to like, well, how do we actually do this? How do we break the work down? You'll certainly have to do all that work, but now you at least have the sort of the fundamental elements, the building blocks of your strategy that answer these core questions and be able to plot them into your one-page strategic plan format.
Hey, Jeff, this is Margot.
Hi, Margot.
Hey, I do have a question. We are on the partners team. We're a little guilty of using the word validate as language. But part of the reason we've done that is because we know that there is importance in validating that area of focus in order to then potentially go down the path of exploring a solution and really wrapping a strategy around that. And I'm just wondering, are you kind of saying more around changing the word from validate to test, or like just changing the language? Because I find if we didn't put it on there, then we would not focus on that at all. And that's right.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and like I said, I'm guilty of it too. So we're all in this boat. It's a very common trap to fall into because there is a desire to want to just let's be sure, let's go validate that this makes sense, right? Where I would push you though is to say, well, what's stopping you from knowing with more certainty? Again, knowing that you won't ever be at 100% certainty, but what's preventing you from being more certain that you can get past validate and to a specific choice? And whether that shows up on the plan or not, I mean, I wouldn't be too fussed about that. If you want to, have it there so you don't lose sight of it, and make it a specific initiative that is like test to learn about this particular partner opportunity, whatever the situation is.
Mhm.
That's fine, because it is more action oriented. I would also say though is like it shouldn't necessarily stop the strategic plan process. That one of the outcomes, we're talking about the monthly review process and I'm in here, but one of the outcomes that is perfectly valid in that review process is to say, we don't know the answer right now. Let's park this for a second. Let's go away. Let's spin up a little project that helps us answer the question that we're facing, does test perhaps, something that gives you the information so you can come back the next time and say, okay, I know this piece of information now, therefore I'm confident that the partner strategy is X. And that's all I'm saying that I'm trying to get to. And there is lots of, I didn't bother going into the content around, you can have really quick and dirty tests, and you can have like sort of long, complex, market tests that drag on for sort of, 3 to 6 months. I'm kind of hoping we can get people just sort of doing quick and dirty tests that confirm assumptions or get more information and get you to a spot to be confidently able to say, we're picking X, we're going this direction because this is what we know.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Great question. So if I understand your question, Mike, sort of around like, hey, how do we kick this process off? If we follow this process, is it one specific question or is it multiple questions we're trying to get to? This is just sort of my opinion. I would say that if the strategic problem is, is big enough and specific enough, but doesn't maybe address all the things that you want to tackle on your team, then I would just go through the process twice. It's certainly conceivable that, you define a problem. And again, I would say whether you're strategic planning or not, this is actually a mechanism they could use for just getting through any sort of work problem that you have to get through with your team. So frame the problem, reframe it, and then generate possibilities, run a process around that, get to a spot where you think you've got a decision or a confident decision, and then revert back, go back and say, okay, well, we have this other problem as well. Let's sort of run the same process. I'd be willing to bet that you would, if you went through that, you would find probably very quickly that there is overlap, and there's in all likelihood there'd be a solution as a mixture of both processes that you ran. So it's a little bit of, it's not A or B, it's sort of C, which is a component of each. But I think the best way, my guidance would be like, just pick the problem, and if it is two distinct problems, then do it, run them in parallel and see how the results sort of marry up at the end.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Marco, which is your question similar? How many strategies should a team have active at one time? So strategies are your choices. Strategies are represented by those areas of focus and the initiatives. I don't think there's necessarily a rule, except personally, I've always been, my preference has always been to land on, somewhere between 3, but not more than 5 areas of focus. And these are major foundational elements, big, broad objectives, if you will, for what you're trying to achieve. There's usually a ton of work that goes into each of them. And so, if you're getting beyond, even 5 objectives is a lot, I would say, you you probably more work to do to pare down the specific choice and the focus that you want to have. Oh, well, I just quit. You just agree with me, Kelly. That's fantastic. Kelly agrees with 3. I think I've got time for one more here. Vic says, how might a team whose focus is internal apply this process? Great question, Vic. Yeah, so Vic's asking, hey, how does this work if we're, largely internal, and using a very specific example of like some teams exist to, help other teams achieve better goals. Honestly, Vic, I personally believe the process still works. All you're doing that's differently is, framing your strategic question around like, how might we better support teams so that they can be as productive as possible, or whatever the language is. Now you've set yourself up to answer a question that is like, oh man, I have to generate all the possible things that I could do to help another team better achieve their goals. Still sort of rooted in the purpose of your team, whatever mission milestone you have, that thing that you want to achieve. I don't know what it might be, but I think those concepts still hold. You're still existing to do something for the organization. It just happens to be predominantly internally focused, but I think all the concepts still hold. Good questions. I am going to move on though. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time touching on goals and metrics. I feel like, this is another spot that some teams can get a little bit tripped up on. Where do goals fit? In fact, it even came up earlier, where do goals fit in this whole thing? First of all, it's really hard to get to your metrics if you haven't properly defined your goals. So let's just, agree that it would be, I think, best practice if you establish your goals first and foremost, and then come back to your metrics, because your metrics should be your gauges telling you giving you some sort of indicator that you're on your way towards achieving those goals or milestones. So what are we talking about when we're talking about goals? Again, the definition is short-term, achievable, measurable end results that a team is intent on achieving. Something a little bit more specific and tangible and near term than the bigger things like your milestone or mission, but they give you an indication that, hey, we got to get here in order to get to the next spot, in order to get to the next spot. This is just a couple of sort of, some guidance, if you will, on thinking about how to create your goals. Is it a statement that's a result or an action? If it's an action, then it's probably not really a goal. Is it vague or is it clear? And this is a really easy one to get tripped up on. Making a goal that's ambiguous makes it really hard to measure. So try to get as much clarity as you possibly can. Is it focused on one or more things? Again, we want it to be singular, not multiple. Is it something that is maintenance mode or is it improvement? I would lean towards something that you're ultimately trying to improve on, not sort of like, let's just sort of maintain what we have. It should be sort of goal-oriented. I think by definition is something you're striving towards. And of course, how does it align with the strategy? Again, I would put goals in the context of that mission and milestone. Some people think, hey, should we have a goal around a specific initiative? You could, but the way this all hangs together is that your initiatives collectively move the needle towards your areas of focus, and you'll know that you've sort of executed on it when you've hit the larger goal made up of all the specific activities you've chosen to do or not do. I said this before, but I'll say it again. Watch out for weasel words. If there's something in your goal statement that talks about efficiency or quality or effective or sustainability, it's probably not very clear or measurable. So try to get as specific as you can that has meaningful content in it. From goals, now we can talk about our metrics. So probably the easiest way to think about your metrics is just to say, okay, out of what I want to achieve, what evidence would suggest that we are achieving it? And this is all about those indicators, that information that you can look at, regularly, that gives you some sort of indication that we are moving towards the goals that we've established for ourselves. A couple of guidance here is a quantification of evidence versus, is it objective as opposed to subjective? Is it gauge the degree to which you're achieving results? Again, does it show you? You should know really quickly, hey, by looking at this metric, does it tell me that I am moving progress, or does it tell me, or do I actually don't know if I'm making progress or not? That's a really good test to say, hey, this metric is relevant or not. And of course, does it give you that regular and ongoing feedback over a period of time, so you can measure it, weekly or monthly or however you want to do it. Clayton yesterday, if you're in that session, talked about metrics in the form of categories: informational, purpose-driven, objective-driven, performance-driven. Those are still relevant. I would just, use these type of criteria to make sure they're specific and objective, and quantification of numbers as much as possible. Bad goals are like dandelions. They might look pretty, but they're actually weeds, and they're not useful, and they ruin your lawn. So no dandelions, specific high quality metrics is what we're looking for here. The last thing, I think this is pretty well the last thing, and then we might have a little bit of time left over, is this monthly review process. So if you've gone through the exercise with your team to create the strategic plan in the way that we talked about here, you should have a foundation now to review it on a monthly basis. And again, going back to the traditional strategic planning methodology, and what we're trying to do completely differently here is that you have to review it and iterate it on a regular basis. Most organizations will fail in executing their strategies because it's this once a year activity, gets done with a whole bunch of excitement and energy, and then it sits on the shelf and everybody sort of goes back to work. The point of reviewing it on a monthly basis is that it's front and center, and you're zooming out, so you're not sort of buried in the project updates or the tactics or the things that you're doing and how well they're going. You're trying to ask all the same questions again. What is it that we're trying to achieve? Are we making progress on achieving it? Is there something that's changed in our environment that should cause us to think about doing something differently, changing course in terms of a strategic choice that we've made previously? Again, are we progressing on those bigger sort of objectives, be it areas of focus or towards the goals and milestones themselves? Are there things that we should stop doing? Are there things that we're doing right now that are just pulling us in the wrong direction, or keeping us away from making progress on the things that we've already decided are most important? Again, going back to that concept of strategic planning is about a choice, often about what not to do. And then does the plan accurately reflect our reality about where we're going and what we were doing? Again, is this sort of consistent with what we're working on, or does it not marry up to the work we're doing right now? Yeah, the point of the plan and doing it on a monthly basis is to sort of reflect on, I like to use the word as a gut check. Hey, are we doing the right things and moving towards that mission and the goals that we've set for ourselves? The coach is a great resource that you can lean on to help facilitate this discussion. So don't forget that that's available to you. And speaking of other content, obviously there is a ton of materials out there. The content that I leaned on primarily for this session comes from Harvard Business Review and IDEO. Actually, both of these articles, the 5 questions and how to create winning strategies, come from a guy named Roger Martin, who's a former dean of Rotman School of Management, and I just like the way he thinks in terms of simplifying the strategic process down to these sort of 5 questions. Table Group is actually an organization run by a guy named Patrick Lencioni you haven't heard of Patrick or read any of his books, they're phenomenal. Have a lot to do with organizational health, team effectiveness, but he does have one called The Advantage where he talks about the 6 critical questions. Again, different terminology, same concepts in terms of that line up extremely closely to, purpose, why we exist, what we're trying to achieve, and how we're going to do it. And the last, but not least, not that we're necessarily in the same league as Harvard, but iQU is a great resource to lean on for more of this content, and the coaching program in particular, where you can use a coach to either facilitate a monthly review process or, help your team design a process for your team to go through a workshop, so to speak, somewhat like what we did today, although there's other options out there to answer these strategic questions. It's a lot of work to sort of facilitate that, and there's a bit of an art to it. So I would encourage you to lean on coaches to help your team have the right conversation, get to that spot where you're answering questions and making decisions around what you'll do to help execute your strategy. And that is it. How are we doing for time, Erin? We have a little bit of time, I think, but not much.
Yeah, we do. So some time for questions, and there's actually one from Michelle in the chat for you.
Great. What skills should one have to get buy-in of all stakeholders, get them fully commit and support to a strategy or strategic plan? Really good question. Actually, I was going to talk about that, and I think I forgot to. So, Michelle, I would say a couple things. First off, going through a process with the team and asking those fundamental questions and exploring possibilities is a really great way to get sort of all the ideas on the table, and using that what would have to be true model to sort of get assumptions on the table. And it does a couple things. One, it sort of allows the conversation to continue, but also it gets you to better understand what are the assumptions that my team members are making for why they feel so passionately about this idea or another idea. So it's a great tool to do together with your team to help understand where they're coming from and the assumptions that they have. And more often than not, you'll find that there is actually agreement, or there's sort of a third way, if you will, around how you can marry up the different options that you have and different perspectives of the team. When it does come to, making that choice after you've gone through that process and thought about all of the options and landed on sort of, hey, the team's kind of all leaning this way. There is a spot, which is a whole other, session in itself, around getting commitment from the team. And in fact, Patrick Lencioni talks about this in one of his books as well, that it is, at a certain point, having gone through this process, the team needs to get to a spot where there's clarity and there's commitment and buy-in. And usually by sort of involving them through a process like this, you can disagree all you want, but, ultimately you get to a spot where, hey, I understand the rationale behind picking this path over this path. May not be my preference, but, I have to sort of disagree and commit, and then help contribute to the team to get us there. Really simplistic answer. That's, a whole, like I said, a whole session in itself. But this does come down, in my mind, comes to one of those team effectiveness things, and how do you get your team to sort of commit and buy in after participating in the whole strategic process. I always have to go back to find the chat. Here it is. Oh yeah, Will's got a fun fact about the Canadian tennis program. So I think I can't remember if I shared this or not, but there's a podcast where there's an interview with Roger Martin. He talks about all the stuff that I talked about, probably in a more more clear way. And he actually uses the example of the Canadian tennis program that literally came from nothing, and they used the what would have to be true model to think about how do we put Canadian tennis program on the map. And it's a phenomenal example of basically starting from nothing, breaking down those barriers, and getting to a pretty cool result. Well done, Will. That's points for fun fact about Canadian tennis strategy. I'm pretty sure you Googled it, but it still counts. All right, guys. Well, maybe I'll wrap it up there. Like I said, there's a ton more content available behind this, and coaches are available if you want to go through it again. But yeah, good luck, all the best. Reach out to your coaches to sort of, if you want to spend more time on this, we're happy to help.